Okay, so we started with the test today. How many of you yawned? Did anyone catch it? All right, it's contagious. My daughter Hope and I were talking about yawns in the car the other day. I couldn't stop yawning. Welcome to motherhood. And how yawning is catching. And she said, I wonder why. And I said, as I often do when they have a question and I don't know the answer, I said, Google it. And so she Googled it, and we found out something fascinating. So yawning is contagious in about 60 to 70% of people. Obviously, our congregation is not indicative of that in this particular instance. But it's not just limited to people. Animals can also catch yawns. I saw a video on Instagram just this week of a guy who was yawning and his horse caught the yawn from him. Why? Well, according to researchers, yawning is a form of unconscious empathy. Rob talked about the passage last week from Romans 12 that says, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Maybe we could add yawn with those who yawn. But this is apparently amplified when we observe yawns from people we're close to. We're more likely to catch yawns from our friends and our family members. We respond unconsciously in our bodies to what's happening in their bodies. Built into our subconscious is a bent toward empathy, even in something as inconsequential as yawning. So last week we began a new series called You, Me, and Empathy, and we stole the title from a children's book by Janine Sanders and Sophia Cordosa. This series is a response to a thread to discussions that we have seen in the news lately, both in the church and outside the church, which asserts that empathy is bad, that empathy is dangerous for followers of Jesus. And so we're going to be exploring that idea in this series. A very basic understanding of empathy will tell us that it is acknowledging in the emotional experience of another person, connecting ourselves to the struggle of another person. And last week we saw that empathy is woven through our scriptures and our call to rejoice with those who rejoice, to mourn with those who mourn. We're told to carry one another's burdens. We also saw that there are barriers to empathy. We looked at 3 of them last week: moral superiority, lack of connection, and fear of culpability. This week I want to look at how empathy is embodied. How do we see God's empathy show up in a human body? How do we see it show up in Jesus and his teachings, and how are we to imitate it? So I want to start by looking at the Gospel of John. The 4 Gospels are the books that tell us the story of Jesus' life. They start with his birth, they move through his ministry, and they end with his death and resurrection. John's Gospel is written differently than the other Gospels. It's deeply theological. He uses a lot of symbolism, and it reads a lot like poetry. So where the other Gospels start with the story of Jesus, with the narration of his birth, John writes this: the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, and the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Right before John writes about the incarnation, or Jesus taking on a human body, he writes this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The world is dark, John writes, but the light shines in the darkness. Jesus came into the darkness to bring the light. In writing about Jesus' birth, in a poetic way, John says, even though the world was dark, even though the world was full of suffering, Jesus chose to come here to be the light. At the beginning of Jesus' earthly life, the very first thing that God chose to do was to enter into human suffering in a body that could suffer. and would suffer. Again, if the definition of empathy is acknowledging and sharing in the emotional experience of people and connecting to human suffering, it seems that Jesus starts with empathy. He doesn't just observe human suffering from a safe distance so it doesn't affect him. He comes toward it, again, in a body that would suffer. I find it really difficult to discount empathy or label it as dangerous when it is at the core of what God does in Jesus. Empathy doesn't end with the incarnation, with God taking on a human body. We see it all the way through Jesus' ministry from beginning to end. I want to look at a story from the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. This is in Matthew 9. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news about the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." I want to look at the word translated as compassion here because it's fascinating to me. It's a Greek word, and it is very fun to say, splagnismai. And it comes from the noun splanchna, which means inward parts, entrails, or bowels. So guts. In Jesus' day, the guts were considered to be the place where deep emotions originated, especially the emotions of mercy, affliction, and pity. So Matthew is saying that Jesus felt for these people in his guts in a deep and visceral way. You might say that the feelings Jesus experienced for these people were gut-wrenching. Now, there are things about Jesus that are difficult for me to understand and to emulate, for sure. But this gut-wrenching empathy, this is a thing about Jesus that I completely get. I'm what's called an empath. That's not just a fun thing I say about myself. That is not just a fun label I give to me. I have talked about this with a counselor. This is a real reality for me. An empath is a person with a high sensitivity who emotionally or physically absorbs the emotions, energy, and physical sensations of other people as if they were their own. I've been this way as long as I can remember, even as a little girl. I've shared before that I used to get emotional about things that I saw on the news. I used to cry and cry and cry about the destruction of the rainforests. It's not funny. I've always been someone who cries at commercials, Jeff can attest, or movies, or when I read things. Like I can't help it. That's the level of gut wrench I feel for people at a distance. It is a whole different animal when I'm up close with someone. I can't explain it to you. I don't know how it happens. It sounds pretty woo-woo. I hear you. All I know is that when I am in proximity to someone who's struggling, I feel it in my body physically, and it's uncomfortable. This happens to me all the time. I was recently at a restaurant where I could tell that somebody was in distress, and my focus was completely absorbed by that person until I knew that they were okay, until the issue was resolved. I couldn't focus on conversation. I couldn't enjoy my food until I knew that person was okay. Another story, I was at my 20-year high school reunion. I won't tell you how long ago that was, but I ran into a classmate at the door, and I can tell that she was incredibly uncomfortable. She was on the verge of a panic attack, and I could physically feel her discomfort. And so I had to wait with her until she was ready to go inside because I knew that I would be uncomfortable until she was comfortable. Again, I cannot explain it. This is just the way that it works for me. My journey with this has been challenging, to say the least. I have learned to survey a situation and ask myself, what is mine to do in this moment? And that looks different every time. But I've also learned to appreciate this as a gift, even when it can be challenging, It's something I've leaned into. I've tried to cultivate it. I've prayed for more of it. I remember the place where I was sitting in college where I asked the Lord for more of this. And let me tell you to be careful what you ask for, because He has done this in my life. And I am grateful for this truth about myself. I now view it as a way to connect with and to discern the needs of other people. And I know that some of you understand this too, because you've shared with me that you experience this as well. So back to Jesus. I can empathize with Jesus in this story. He sees that these people are harassed, that they are helpless, and that they are without direction and care. And that wrenched his guts. And here's where we see what empathy for Jesus followers looks like. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few." Jesus uses the word harvest here. And this is a metaphor that we see throughout Scripture to symbolize people who are ready to respond to God in some way. People who are familiar with harvesting know that it's time sensitive. If you don't pick things when they're ready, you won't have another chance. And they know that you need lots of workers because there is lots of work to do. Jesus tells his followers, hey, we have an opportunity here. These people are ready to respond to God, and we need to act now. He turns his empathy, his gut-wrenching empathy, into action. He embodies it. He acts on it in his body. After noticing the struggles of these people, Jesus doesn't say, oh, friends, look at these people. They are struggling. They are lost. They are in need of help. Take pity. No. Jesus says, these people are suffering. These people are ready to respond to God. And what are we going to do about it? There's a reason the Greek word splagnizomai is translated to compassion in the translation I've chosen today. In our modern English, compassion and empathy are different. Whereas empathy is acknowledging and sharing in the emotional experience of another person, compassion acknowledges it, but goes a step further with a desire for action. So Jesus inspires his followers to take action on what they are feeling. A modern day equivalent to this scenario could be the phrase, thoughts and prayers. This is a term that's been highly politicized around various issues in our time. On its surface, this is not an offensive statement. It's how it's used and what follows it. That's the problem. It's often used by people with platforms, right? Politicians or other public figures after tragic events like mass shootings, for example. They might go on social media. They might make speeches offering condolences, saying things like, my thoughts and prayers go out to the victims. Again, on the surface, this is not a bad statement. But what happens next from people who might have the power to affect some change is a whole lot of nothing. Jesus cautions his followers against this. Back to the passage, he says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send workers into his harvest field. Ask the Lord of the harvest, prayers, to send workers, action. Jesus essentially says, thoughts aren't enough. Prayers and action are what I am calling you to. Unless you say, Ashley, prayer is so incredibly important. Are you downplaying prayer? Absolutely not. Prayer is essential to the lives of believers. And more times than not, God wants to answer prayers through his people. Because that's how they see that God is real and that God is moving and acting in the world. James, the brother of Jesus, expands on this idea after Jesus' death. He writes, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? So we see that Jesus experiences gut level empathy for people who are suffering, and he moves toward them, and he calls his followers to act on their empathy as well. He calls them to embody it, to be empathy incarnate as he is. Jesus also explores this idea of embodied empathy in some of his parables. I would argue that we could see this in the parable of the Good Samaritan, in the parables of the lost sheep and coins, the parable of the unforgiving servant, and the parable of the prodigal son. I want to look at the prodigal son to help flesh this out a little bit more today. We did a series on parables a while back, so if this interests you and you want to do more of a deep dive into those, they're on the website. I would encourage you to go back and listen to those. We find the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. So we see that Jesus uses parables or short stories to communicate the way that things work in his kingdom. Now, the kingdom of God is a reality parallel to ours, in which God reigns and which his ideals for all of creation are revealed. So that's what Jesus is talking about in his parables, life in the kingdom. And this particular parable, well, all of them, are so rich with teachings from Jesus. We have a whole message, again, just on this one on the website. But today, I want to look at what I believe it specifically can teach us about empathy. So I'm reading from Luke 15. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he, the father, divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him." So here we see the same Greek word, splagnizomai, applied to the father that was applied to Jesus in the passage we read earlier. The father felt this same gut-wrenching empathy toward his son, and he felt driven to alleviate the suffering of his wayward child. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." And here is where we see the embodied empathy. But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." So the father pulls out all the stops and he sinks a lot of money and resources into making his younger son feel welcome after his time away. Why? Because he is so moved by his empathy, by this connection that he feels to his baby boy's suffering, that he has to act on it. He has to let his son know that regardless of what he has done, regardless of what he has lost, he is welcome and he is safe, and this is still his home. We often tell our kids, we try hard to do this, there is nothing you can do ever to make us love you any less. This is always your home. You always have a home with us. And now we see the older brother's response. Spoiler, it is different. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." So we see that the father and the older son are kind of set up as foils here, if we're talking about empathy. The father is moved towards his suffering son. The older brother is moved away. Here we can very see one of those barriers to empathy that Rob introduced us to last week, moral superiority. He probably did look at his younger brother and say, "Told you so. You're suffering because you brought it on yourself." But the father says to him, the older son, "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Parables invite us to see ourselves in the story. This is one of the things that makes them so genius. In our parables series, Rob did a really beautiful reading of this parable that challenged us to envision ourselves in the role of the father, to see that it is the father's job, that it is our job to count both of the sons, right? Everyone is worthy of love. Everyone is welcome. The rule followers, who sometimes can become self-righteous, and the rule breakers. Upon first hearing the parable, some of us might rush to place ourselves in the role of the younger son. After all, we've all been the younger son at one time or another. We have squandered opportunities. We have harmed ourselves. We have harmed other people. We haven't followed the rules. And we identify with this character because maybe we like the idea of the grace that is shown despite bad choices. These things are good for reflection. But if I'm being honest, the person with whom I naturally identify in this story, this is me, isn't the youngest brother, it's the oldest one. I'm the oldest child in my family. I'm also a rule follower. I get it. He doesn't feel as if he's done anything wrong. He has tried. He has really tried to be a good son. He has tried to meet his father's expectations. He has tried to be productive. He has tried to honor his dad's good name. His reaction to what's going on in the story is normal. His reactions are warranted. They are not sinful. Sometimes that is read in to this parable, but I don't believe that's the point. It's making it all. One of the things that Jesus does in telling this parable is to expand his followers' ability to enter into the suffering of other people. He's telling them that this is what it looks like in his reality, in his kingdom. At the beginning of this parable, we're told that the younger son requested his father's inheritance early. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Our modern eyes skip right on over this, but there's a whole novel contained in these sentences. In Jesus' day, this would have been an unusual request. It would have been considered to be a foolish request. According to Jewish law, fathers gave their inheritance after they had passed away. It was built into the system. It was rare for them to begin giving their inheritance away while they were still alive. This may have been viewed as disrespectful, shameful even. It could have put the father in a precarious financial situation as well, depending on what they were going through. Jesus says, so the father divided his property among the sons. We don't see any pushback from the father at all. And this is our first clue that the father cares so deeply for his son. In the first 3 sentences, the younger son disrespected his father and possibly exposed him to scandal and financial troubles. These were willful choices. Sometimes people accidentally suffer through no fault of their own, right? Maybe they get injured or they get sick. Maybe they're in a relationship and that person leaves them. Maybe their partner dies. Maybe a child dies. Maybe a friend or a parent passes away. It is easy to extend empathy to those people, right? And we're expanding on a thought from last week. But that's not the case with this younger brother. He does things on purpose, knowing that his family could be hurt, but he doesn't seem to care. Here's where Jesus asks his followers to expand their understanding of empathy. The younger brother left. He asked for the inheritance early. He heard his father. He didn't care. And then he lost it all on wild living, and he had nothing to show for it. And when famine came, he was starving, and he was out of options. He was facing the consequences of his choices. And when he returned home, his father modeled and expanded and embodied empathy. He could have said, oh no, look at him. He's hungry. How sad. But he was driven to action. One of the messages we find in this parable is that in the kingdom, our empathy should expand beyond the normal boundaries that we set for each other. It should extend even to those who willfully make choices that lead to the suffering for themselves and other people. We should challenge ourselves to identify with the emotional experiences of other people, even when they're hurting because of choices that they made on purpose. I'm not saying that this is easy. Few of Jesus' teachings about the kingdom are. Earlier in the book of Luke, chapter 6, Jesus says, but to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Even when people willfully do harm, we're challenged by Jesus to extend love and empathy. We are challenged, like the father in the story, to invite them into health and wholeness and community. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. This doesn't mean that followers of Jesus are to be doormats. Not at all. And I hope you don't take that idea away from this series on empathy. That's one of the arguments for people who say that empathy is bad and that it's dangerous. Make no mistake that we are called to be people who discern. We are called to be people who are eyes up for bad fruit, as Jesus calls it. Patterns of behavior that when enabled and when encouraged can lead to terrible consequences. We are called to be people of justice who try to prevent harm and protect people, and that includes ourselves. But like forgiveness, empathy is something that does not depend on the other person. You don't need anything from the other person in order to extend empathy to them. You don't need to agree with them. They don't need to change anything or apologize to you in order for you to extend empathy. We see in the story that the younger brother, in essence, apologizes. We don't know if it's genuine. We don't know if he's going to go back out into the world and squander everything his father gives him again. We don't know, but it doesn't matter. One of the ways I try to do this is by envisioning people as children. I try to envision people as innocent, open-hearted kids with bedhead and sweet voices. That's my process. We can extend empathy by challenging ourselves to identify with the struggles of other people. No child sets out and says, I'm going to set my life on fire. I'm going to wreck everything on purpose and hurt myself and other people. Now, they may willfully make choices that get them there, but they don't start out that way. Like forgiveness, empathy shapes us to be more like Jesus, who, by coming to earth and living in an imperfect body that could suffer, embodied empathy. This is an area in which I've been really challenged, both in my professional and personal relationships and in my views of people in positions of power. I have a really strong desire for people to face consequences when they harm other people. I value justice. So I think another way that this parable can speak to us is that it reminds us that people do face earthly consequences for their actions, whether overtly, as in the case of the younger son who squandered everything and ended up starving, or covertly. Here I think of people who treat others poorly and consequently end up alone, trapped in self-loathing. There are many ways to experience hell on earth. Sometimes it's a hell of our own making. We may not always be able to see it in other people. It may seem as though they are thriving or getting away with wild living, as the parable says, but they're likely privately experiencing real and brutal consequences. Despite that, many days I don't want to be empathetic towards people who hurt others. I want to. Like forgiveness, we don't have to be fully ready to start the process of trying to connect with other people's struggles. Being faithful here just means trying to identify, trying to imagine the circumstances that led them to where they are now. Back to the prodigal son. When the older son hears the party in progress, he expresses his frustration with his dad for welcoming his brother back and for being so generous to him after all he's done. His father replies, "My son, you're always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The father is so gentle with this brother. He doesn't scold him. To me, this is an empathetic response. He acknowledges the struggle here. He honors it. He sees that he has neglected to count and welcome his oldest son. I imagine he softens the tone of his voice as he says, "Everything I have is yours." My response to your brother doesn't diminish that. But he is committed to a reality, a kingdom reality, is Jesus' point here, that says we are all to be reconciled to one another. We are to be connected no matter what someone has done that has led them to their struggles, either internal or no. We are to challenge ourselves to embody this kind of empathy. This is at the core of what Jesus did, and it's at the core of kingdom living. So the parable ends there. The chapter ends there. So the question is, will the oldest brother go into the party? Because the father invites everyone. Will the older brother follow in his father's example and embody empathy for his little brother? Will he set aside the hurt and the frustration and the confusion and the anger to be reconciled to him? And the question for us is, in this open ending, will we join the party? Will we, as followers of Jesus, take on this role and enter into suffering? Will we extend empathy even when it's hard, even when we think the consequences of actions are deserved, even when they've hurt us? My prayer, of course, is that we will. This is a countercultural response to suffering. This response is certainly a counter to those who claim that empathy is dangerous, because the fact is, everyone is invited to the party. It's God's desire, and it should be our desire that we see everybody on the inside. An empathetic response that drives us to action makes us more like Jesus. With practice, may we get to a place where empathy becomes something we do unconsciously. Let's pray. God, thank you for showing us what embodied empathy looks like. We want to see people the way you do, as worthy of understanding and love, even when they act in ways that lead to suffering. Work in us so that this becomes second nature. Amen.